This is Environmental Science 1, Chapter 5, Part 2 on water. In this portion of the video lecture, we will be discussing causes and effects of freshwater pollution. Pollution of any kind, especially water pollution, is going to introduce chemical, physical, or biological agents into the water. And due to those things being in the water quality degrades. Chemical agents would be any type of either organic or inorganic chemicals introduced to a freshwater system. Physical agents, those would be, for example, a lot of factories and manufacturing places use water as a cooling agent for some of their machinery, or maybe in some cases storage of their product. And so when water is used in a cooling system, that water absorbs heat, and then that heated water is released into a lake, river, stream, or pond, which will cause the overall temperature to rise. Biological agents, those would be considered things like organic wastes from animals. Biological agents could also be bacteria or viral strains that are introduced into the water supply. All three of those things, however, will degrade water quality. Freshwater pollution is caused by two reasons mainly: industrialization and the human population explosion. So when we talk about the different types of pollutants that can be in freshwater, we can talk about pathogens, which are the virus or bacterial strains that get into the water. If people consume that water, we could get very sick. Pathogens in the water supply are a big problem in developing countries because developing countries have very low technology available to them to help keep their freshwater resources clean. And illnesses and deaths due to pathogens in water in developing countries is significantly high. Organic matter, things again like animal wastes, those can be introduced into the water. Organic chemicals, inorganic chemicals as well. Toxic chemicals, things like radioactive waste or different types of heavy metals that are very poisonous and toxic to living things, like mercury or cadmium or lead. Physical agents, again, that heating or overcooling of water. Radioactive waste, different types of also radioactive leftover medical supplies and treatments that get introduced into a freshwater ecosystem. All of these things can degrade that water quality. So where does all of this stuff come from? There's a couple of different ways that we can look at pollution as far as being introduced into a freshwater ecosystem. Point pollution is where you can identify one single source of where that pollution is coming from. You can identify how it entered the freshwater ecosystem. If, for example, there was a river that was near a factory and there are chemicals that are being used in the factory that they illegally dump into the river, if those chemicals are identified in that river as coming from that particular factory, again, that's one single point of where that pollutant is coming from. Non-point pollution is a little bit more difficult to identify because non-point pollution comes from a lot of different sources that end up in a freshwater ecosystem. Pesticides, for example, pesticides from runoff. When we put things in our lawns to help keep our lawns green or to keep weeds out of our lawn. Every time it rains, we get excess water that runs off and washes off into storm drains and the like. And those storm drains eventually come out into some type of freshwater resource. So we can get pesticides from runoff, road salt, adding those chemicals, that would be inorganic chemicals, into a freshwater ecosystem, fertilizers that we use either in a home type of use in a yard or agricultural fertilizers. All of those things can cause a degradation of water quality. But non-point pollution is pollution caused by a lot of different types of agents. So if we have our degraded water, we need to clean it up. So wastewater treatment plants help take fresh water that is not of usable, safe drinking quality to people, and we clean it up. The very first phase of wastewater treatment is where we're going to filter out all of the large particles in the water. That happens in what's called a sedimentation tank. Sediments don't always have to be particles of sand or gravel or clay. Any large particle, things like if you have a garbage disposal and you use that, the food particles that aren't able to dissolve, those would be considered large particles. As far as human waste is concerned, there's parts of human waste that come in a large particle form. So sedimentation tanks filters out the big stuff and cleans that out of the water. Aeration tanks. Aeration tanks pump air through the water. So in most water treatment plants, they have helpful decomposers or helpful bacteria to help break down that sewage. And in some cases, some of those large organic particles. So aeration tanks puts air through the water. And then an ending process is taking a little bit of chlorine and adding that to the water supply. The chlorinator will kill harmful bacteria or other organisms that are considered pathogens in the water. Now, there's not enough chlorine that you would taste that in your water, but there's enough chlorine at a safe level where it will kill the bacteria in the water, but it will not harm you. So just as a general overall look at a wastewater treatment plant, again, the primary treatment, we can see that is kind of taking care of getting the particles out of the water. Then once we have cleaner water, we can start to aerate it and filter it out and perhaps disinfect that water if need be. Unfortunately for our wastewater treatment plants, it does not take everything out of our drinking water supply. There is some research going into the amount of chemicals from medications that are improperly flushed down the toilet, or in cases of people ingesting their medications, if they do not use all of that chemical in their medication, they release that in their urine. We have the ability to take out some organic and inorganic chemicals, but not all. A byproduct of wastewater treatment is this really awesome stuff called sludge. So all of the large particles that had to be removed in the sedimentation tank become what's known as sludge. Sludge often contains chemicals that are not bad. We need to reduce those chemicals in the sludge before we dispose of that. So when sludge is treated, it can actually be used as a fertilizer in some cases. And there are some buildings that are trying to use more green and sustainable products by actually solidifying and baking sludge bricks and kind of making them into a building product so you can actually build with treated sludge. Again, pathogens are another way that water quality can degrade. These are disease-causing organisms. Pathogens can enter the water supply through either untreated wastewater or human or animal feces. Again, that's going to put bacteria, viruses in the water that can cause sickness and degrades water quality. So why do we care? Well, we don't want our freshwater resources polluted because it really does affect not just people, but the whole ecosystem. So if toxins are present in the ecosystem, in some cases we can get kind of a snowball effect occurring. In the 1950s, a pesticide with the name of DDT was often used on farms. It was a great pesticide, killed everything, all the insects, no bugs in our crops. However, the effects of DDT were very long lasting because what ended up happening was DDT made its way through the food chain through what's called biological magnification. So when you get a small amount of DDT present and that organism in an organism and another heterotroph comes by and eats it, that DDT will accumulate and magnify in that next organism. So the further up the food chain you are, the worse that can be for biological magnification. When we talk about lakes and rivers and streams, when lakes become naturally, over time, we can have natural causes of water pollution too. Freshwater pollution isn't just caused by man. Nature can actually do a little bit of that as well. Lakes that become eutrophic, they will become eutrophic naturally over time. Organisms die and add nutrients, which helps the ecosystem and those plants and animals that rely on those nutrients. However, sometimes if we get a lot of inorganic nutrients, especially things in like fertilizers that make its way into a lake, river, or stream, it can cause what's called an algal bloom. So algae just goes nutso because it has all of this yummy nitrogen and phosphorus, and it keeps reproducing by mitosis. And so, a very small group of algae can turn into a giant blob of it and can actually choke and kill out a lake. It will cut sunlight from the bottom of the lake or river or pond, which will cut photosynthesis, which is bad for the plants. It can also suck all of the oxygen out of a lake, pond, or river, causing fish and those things to die as well. Thermal pollution is another thing. When you think, oh, hot and cold water, how bad can that be? There's no chemicals in it. But remember, everything relies on average temperatures. So when we talk about industrial pollution, taking a look at not putting in water into a freshwater ecosystem that is has been heated or cooled excessively, because that can cause massive fish kills. So this is when, again, excessive amounts of heat is added to water. It's going to raise the temperature. It'll throw off the balance of the ecosystem. In 1972, we finally kind of decided to make sure and protect our United States water supplies with the Clean Water Act. So what happened with the Clean Water Act? Agricultural wastes were treated before they were being released into rivers or lakes. Some companies started to kind of recycle their water instead of just dumping it into the nearest freshwater resource. They would use it again. If it was something that was heated, perhaps they would have it in a tank to cool it off so they could reuse that water over and over again. Another thing that we need to be concerned about is groundwater pollution. Remember, aquifers take a really, really long time to form. And so if you get pollution in an aquifer, it can take a really, really long time to clean up. And just a little water for thought, I guess. Bottled water. A lot of people think that that's the best type of water that you can drink. But believe it or not, bottled water is not tested for pollutants or toxins as often as public water supplies. So the water that comes out of your faucet is tested and treated more often than bottled water. Just a little interesting factoid for you there. This has been Environmental Science 1, Chapter 5, Part 2 on water.